Lori Vallow was the kind of woman who seemed to have it all. But that sweet girl next door was changing.
She's lost her mind.
So how does she pose a threat to your children?
I don't know what she's going to do with them.
I'm Sarah Treleavan, and this is Madness of Two. Over the last year, I've been investigating the case of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell. How together, police say they plotted the deaths of Lori's two children, JJ and Tylee, something they've denied. Join me in Madness of Two, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I'm your host, Rebecca Sebastian, and I am so excited to present another episode in this cult-adjacent series we've been doing these last few weeks. We're going to talk about a really current case that's playing out in court right now, and we're going to talk about it through the lens of the podcast, The Followers' Madness of Two. I sat down with the host and producer, Sarah Treleavan, and we had a great conversation about how cultic beliefs, religious fanaticism play into this story, and what do we do with them, and do they even matter in light of evidence and court proceedings. That I also interviewed Beth Karras, who we reference in this episode. She is a former Manhattan district attorney and the legal advisor on several media projects, including this podcast, Madness of Two. I have an interview with her on Patreon, which you can join to hear. But just an update though, since speaking with both Beth and Sarah, there's been a change in the status of Lori's case. They at first were going to be tried together, Lori and Chad. Then they were separated because of Lori's mental health condition, and the judge just ruled that they will be tried together again. So that has changed since this interview, just as an FYI update. You're also going to hear that there is a bonus episode, which is now out. So do yourself a favor, subscribe and download to Madness of Two. And I guarantee you will learn something about the story you didn't know. And the conversation with Sarah and her insight on the family members and Lori and Chad themselves is so interesting. And I appreciated her perspective on the case. Thank you, Sarah, for killing the small talk. Enjoy the episode. Sarah, welcome to Dialogue Podcast. I'm very excited to talk to you today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Oh, good. You know, I was sending over the questions for you to review and thinking, I know a lot about this case, and even more so now that I am up to speed and listened to the new podcast, The Followers' Madness of Two. And yet I still have a hard time finding my way into this story. Like, it's always clear to me what my through line with a guest will be. Like, oh, here's where we're going to start and where we're going to go. Yeah. And in this case, I find it really difficult. I'm like, are we talking about extreme beliefs? Are we talking about missing children? Are we talking about abuse? What are we talking about? So
all of it. I mean, that's the crazy thing. It's all of it. And with every episode, I mean, it was really fascinating putting these things together because we were like, which rabbit holes do we want to limit ourselves to with this particular episode? Because you could just go off in every direction. There are so many players. You know, I remember one weekend shortly after starting this project, I was talking to my mother-in-law and I was explaining the details of this case. And then I started to talk a little bit about the kids. And I was like, JJ, his situation, it was like his grandmother, who's also his aunt, and I was like, just forget about it. Like, just forget it. Not important. We'll just move on.
Right. The capacity to understand all the complexities. It's like we have a threshold and I don't know if we can actually retain it all. But how did this come your way, this story? And were you aware of it? Were you following it before you started working on it for the podcast?
I was. So I had been following it, you know, sort of very peripherally. It was just one of those weird stories. I remember reading about this mother in Idaho whose kids were missing, and she was like in Hawaii. And it's, I mean, what struck me about that, I think there are some similarities with the Gabby Petito case, is you're just delivered these pieces of information that strike you as so fundamentally ominous. It's like, well, this can't possibly end well. Right. This can't be a misunderstanding. This can't be something that gets cleared up. This has to just be the harbinger of something really, really awful. It just, again, seemed so counter-normative that she wouldn't help. And so it was like, well, there has to be an enormous story behind that, behind her unwillingness. And of course, we now know there was.
There was, right. And that's something that's troubled me about, what hasn't troubled me about this case, but not having to compel someone to produce the kids that you're responsible for is a weird part of this case to me. Like, there were suspicions, there were reports of wellness checks, families were concerned. And yet it seemed like she was given a lot of room and benefit of the doubt. And yes, law enforcement went and checked her stories, and then they didn't check out. So they did follow up. And so I don't want to completely say like they dropped the ball or anything, but why do you think she was given so much latitude in that situation?
So I think there's actually a lot of reasons. I think, of course, she's an attractive, blonde, middle-class white woman, and that conceals a lot. I think when it comes to the family, it's interesting. I spoke to Lori's nephew recently, and he said that he really started to notice that she had become, that essentially that she was self-radicalizing when they moved back from Hawaii in like 2017, she and Charles and the children. And that's when he first noticed the shift in her. So from 2017 to January 2019 is when Charles Vallow presents this to the police as a crisis. There had just been this prolonged decline in possibly her mental health, but certainly she was just saying crazier and crazier things. And one of the things that Zach, her nephew, told me is that, the family was sort of concerned, but they were also like, well, she's still getting dinner on the table every night. She's still picking JJ up from school. She's still going about the motions of everyday family life. And I think people really cling to that normalcy. I think we all would like to believe that if our family member was exhibiting some of these signs, the first time your family member is like, and pedophiles are, running this whole thing out of a pizza parlor, you'd be like, okay, let's get you medicated. But I think in reality, there's like a cognitive dissonance that occurs when somebody and you love is in crisis in this way.
And do you think because some of these crazier ramblings and rants, and I would call them some delusions, do you think because they were religious in nature too, there was a little forgiveness or room to see how that played out because they weren't maybe indicators of violence or danger towards the kids? Do you think that's why it went on so long?
Yeah, I think that that's part of it. And I think, in episode 3, we look at sort of more historic connections to this case, Lori's abusive third marriage, as she has characterized it. And we speak to her ex-sister-in-law, Annie Cushing, and she sort of talks about these kind of uncomfortable parts of Lori that weren't like sort of full-blown alarming elements, but, Lori talking about how God wanted her to be on Wheel of Fortune.
Right.
Okay. And then she tells somebody else during the course of her divorce that, she believes that Tylee is the reincarnation of her dead sister. It's like, okay. And then, she tells somebody who works in child welfare that she believes that her now dead former attorney is still visiting her at night and providing legal advice. Okay. So that all seems a bit nuts, but, I think the thing about these beliefs being somewhat religious in nature, I read recently that more Americans believe in the existence of angels than in evolution. And so, once you're already in that place, it gets a little harder to say what's crazy.
Right. And it's really dangerous territory, honestly, to start evaluating someone's religious beliefs if they're not yours and deeming them, as like a mental health crisis. So that's where this gets so complicated, because it seems like both were happening at once. So how do you suss out which is which? And does it even matter in terms of motive? Because now we have evidence, right? And so that's what I think the podcast does so well, is that it explores these issues for the person who's peripherally been following this crazy story, but then says, but wait, there's more. Now there's court and trial proceedings. So how much do you think this will matter in the courtroom?
How much do I think religiosity, the idea of religiosity and religious freedom, will matter?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, in part because my understanding, based on people I've spoken to, is that the court or the prosecution is not going to focus on Chad and Lori's religious beliefs.
Right.
That they are going to focus on the much more pragmatic, unambiguously criminal aspects of this case. You know, like Lori continuing to take the kids' Social Security money even after it was clear that they were dead. Chad having Tammy sign on for expanded life insurance shortly before she died. Things like that. You know, the circumstantial evidence they have about the placement of individuals in relation to the victims at the time they were killed. My understanding is that is the case they are building, that they are not really exploring the idea of whether or not it's legitimate to believe that people can become zombies.
Yeah, that makes sense as a strategy. And the good news is they have enough. I mean, there's a lot of evidence. And another thing that was revealed in your podcast that I didn't know was what you're speaking to, which is this financial component, that there were some incentives, if you will, for these disappearances and, you know, now we know murders. But that seems like the way to go for the courtroom. And yet it is such a big part of the story, their religious beliefs. So to go back to that for a second, is it a cult in your opinion? And does that make Chad the leader? Do you think Lori was more of the instigator, or is something about them? I mean, the title is The Madness of Two, which is, you know, comes from the French. I'm going to say it, but I'm going to butcher it. I've been practicing. It's like folie à deux. I don't know.
Folie à deux. Yeah.
Folie à deux.
Yeah, you said, yeah.
Okay. So that's like a clinical term. Do you think what's happening here, just in your opinion at this point?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's no doubt in my mind and in the minds of most of the people I have interviewed that if Chad and Lori had never met in person, they may have faced crises of other types. But if they had never met, the kids would still be alive. Charles would still be alive. Tammy would still be alive. And it's very possible that Alex might still be alive as well. You know, Lori's interesting, and I'm sure we'll get into this, why we focus so much on Lori. But, you know, it appears that she sort of self-radicalized over a period of time, over a period of years. Chad was sort of weirdly stable. And in this, I say that in the way that he was like weird, but it was stable. Like he was weird in the same way for like many, many years.
Yeah.
You know, he was pushing this idea that he had these near-death experiences and that enabled him to become a prophet of sorts. He could communicate directly with the, you know, other side. But I think that the term that gets thrown around a lot when it comes to these two is a perfect storm. Mm-hmm. They came together in a perfect storm of wants and needs. Mm-hmm. You know, we don't yet know all the details of how they convinced each other or themselves to be involved in all of this. But it does appear that they did very much work in tandem, that they were a true partnership. I don't know whether Lori saw Chad as a spiritual leader that she had been missing, but I don't think that we can lay culpability at one person's feet.
Okay. I wonder if her support of him emboldened him, because he didn't have this massive following. Like he was leading small groups and he did have a podcast. He'd written books, but it wasn't like he had this swelling movement around him. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was sort of like, you know, I mean, I've asked one of the first things that I've asked anyone I've spoken to who lives in the Rexburg area is, had you ever heard of Chad Daybell before any of this happens? And people are always saying no. You know, they had no idea. He had a very, very niche following, especially for somebody who claims to be a prophet and to know exactly what the future holds. And like, you know, I suspect you're right that he didn't believe that he had the attention that he deserved. there's an enormous amount of arrogance there. I mean, even to suggest like that you are some sort of mouthpiece for divine beings, there's an enormous amount of hubris and arrogance there. And you see that across this case. I'm not sure exactly what convinced these two that they could get away with anything. It is so wild. Like the things they did, the sloppiness of it is so wild. It almost suggests that they were in the grips of some sort of clouding religiosity, you know, that they couldn't see straight.
Wow.
But then, you know, they also tried to cover their tracks. They highly motivated to take care of sort of all of their, not just basic needs, but, you know, all earthly needs, let's say, you know. So I just think this case, it points in a million different directions.
It really does. And when you say some of the sloppiness, what are you referring to? Like, where are the points in the case where you're just like, that was bad?
So, you know, it comes out in ways big and small. And I think there seem to be some investigative failings in this case. You know, I mean, Lori telling everyone that she was a god who no longer needed to eat and really casting an enormous amount of suspicion in her direction is a bit sloppy if you're planning on committing a lot of crimes. You know, and then there are other things too. There's like sort of a sheer callousness to a lot of their actions. Like there's this security cam video of Lori and Chad dropping off the kids' things at a storage unit they've rented.
Yeah.
And in one of the videos, Chad is patting Lori on the ass. And there's something about that, you know, as they're loading the kids' bikes, a backpack with JJ's initials, you know, into this room shortly after the kids have been killed. There is just, I guess it's not just sloppy. It just speaks to a sort of very callous remove that they were able to maintain and that they have to seemingly have continued to maintain since all of this started almost 2 years ago.
Yeah, that disconnect. There's a very small piece of audio in your podcast. It's right after Lori's brother has killed her husband, her fourth husband, Charles.
Her fourth husband, yeah.
She's had just moved in the house. And again, I think this speaks to the very beginning of our conversation about kind of what she's afforded, and her brother too. I mean, the way law enforcement treated them after a shooting, not everybody might get the same response from American law
100%.
enforcement. So she's just outside casually with her daughter, Tylee, and they're asking what's going on. And it's a very small moment, but it really chilled me because she said, oh yeah, we just moved in. So it's like, sorry, neighbors. Like as if it was like a dog barking incident in the middle of the night or a disruption on their lawn from a moving truck. And it was a killing just happened, you know, in the morning, the daylight hours in their house. It was a major disconnect. But her ability to be casual after that really haunted me. So yeah, callous, disconnected. It's really bizarre. And now that we're talking about Alex, I think the relationship with her brother and her oldest son, Colby, are interesting to me. Alex seems to be her like protector in a way and kind of right-hand man. But then Colby, I feel like she protects. It's her first son from maybe her first or second marriage. I can't remember. So
Second marriage.
So he's older than Tylee and JJ. So they have a different relationship. But why do you think he was spared from Lori's, you know, from unfortunately what we saw she was capable of? Do you think he was just out of her grip because he was older?
Colby is quite a bit older. You know, he's in his mid-20s. I don't think he was spared entirely in the sense that I believe that I have not spoken directly to Colby, but my understanding is that he too was aware of these creeping fringe beliefs that Lori had and the sort of like, you know, how they came on like so many things gradually and then suddenly. But yeah, I mean, Colby has been married for a while. I think he has one daughter. So I think he had his own life that was somewhat removed from Lori's immediate existence. So I think he probably knew that Lori was saying some crazy things. I think he probably, like a lot of the rest of the family, hoped it would go away. I don't think he had a sense that the kids were in imminent danger, like most of the rest of the family. But I think he was just out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
And I think, people tend to look at this case in a pretty binary way, either that Lori genuinely believed that the kids needed to die for their own sake, that we were heading into a period of intense chaos in preparation for the return of Christ, and that the kids would be way better off dead. This was the way to save them. Then she would be with them for, eternity. Or that Lori was just calculating. She wanted out of her mundane everyday life. She wanted the kids out of the way. She wanted some cash. She wanted to go live on a beach in Hawaii and indulge a fantasy. I mean, either way, I'm not entirely sure. Well, I was going to say, I'm not entirely sure why Tylee, who kind of had one foot out the door, I believe she had been emancipated. I'm not sure why she was sort of seen as an obstruction to this new life.
Yeah.
The other theory that gets floated with her is that she had seen too much.
Well, I get that sense. It wasn't on your podcast because it was footage. So obviously I didn't see it on your podcast. It must have been the Dateline or something where there's footage of her in a police room with Lori talking. And I don't remember specifics. I just remember being like, this poor teenage girl has seen some stuff, and her body language was very uncomfortable. And she seemed to be kind of in a weird, like parental role to Lori. It was just all so uncomfortable. The poor girl. So yeah, I think that actually tracks to me because she was there when Charles was killed or shortly after. She's just been there for so much. And JJ was a bit younger and maybe somehow more protected from some of that. But I wonder too if the truth is just somewhere in the middle, like where it usually is. Like Lori wanted what she wanted. Lori and Chad were selfish and they wanted this life without interruption. And also they had these insane extreme beliefs, and the kind of somewhere in the middle, this plan was hatched, and here we are. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that that's probably so. And I mean, I think on one hand, they didn't like really cover their tracks in a way that was like particularly successful, and in a way that suggests that they were immune from consequences. But on the other hand, they did still try to cover their tracks, and they did things that can be construed as pragmatic and highly self-interested. Right. And one of the things that I also come back to all the time, there's the money, which is an interesting piece of this. I always think about those pictures of Chad in Hawaii, where the second time they go back, they're already married, they're back in Hawaii. The media has tracked them down, and we play some of this footage in the podcast where the media is, Nate Eaton of East Idaho News is like, where are your children? Yes. And they refuse to answer. And it's sort of a stunning moment because, they seem, Chad and Lori, a bit put out by this line of inquiry, But what's also fascinating is Chad looks great. Like Chad has gone from this like chubby nobody, as Nate Sunderland described him, a potato man, to he somehow looks taller. He's like, he's clearly been working out. Lori was a hairdresser for a period of time. Clearly she's finally given him a decent haircut. And, maybe he was getting fit for Jesus, but I suspect there was something else going on there. And I think it does really speak to what these two really wanted.
I am so thrilled to announce that Stamps.com is a sponsor of the show because I personally use and rely on Stamps.com. If you have ever received a t-shirt, mug, note, or sticker from yours truly, it has arrived to you via Stamps.com. Since 1998, Stamps.com has been an indispensable tool for nearly 1 million businesses. Stamps.com brings the services of the U.S. Postal Service and UPS right to your computer. Whether you're an office sending invoices, a side hustle Etsy shop, or a full-blown warehouse shipping out orders, Stamps.com will make your life easier. All you need is a computer and a standard printer. No special supplies or equipment. Within minutes, you're up and running, printing official postage for any letter, any package, anywhere you want to send it. And you'll get exclusive discounts on postage and shipping from USPS and UPS. Once your mail is ready, just schedule a pickup or drop it off. No traffic, no lines. cut the confusion out of shipping. With Stamps.com's new Rate Advisor tool, you can compare shipping rates and timelines to easily find the best option. Save time and money with Stamps.com. There is no risk. And with my promo code POD, that's P-O-D, you get a special offer that includes a 4-week trial plus free postage and a digital scale. No long-term commitments or contracts. Just go to Stamps.com, click on the microphone at the top of the homepage and type in POD, P-O-D. That's Stamps.com, promo code POD. Stamps.com. Never go to the post office again.
Hi, we're Eliza,
Allison,
and Carlin, and we're the hosts of Resolved Mysteries podcast. Our podcast follows the 80s and 90s television show Unsolved Mysteries, hosted by Robert Stack.
if you like true crime stuff, ghost stuff, alien stuff, this is your podcast.
We do in-depth research on all of the segments that Unsolved Mysteries aired and give you the latest updates on every case.
Resolved Mysteries podcast is available wherever you get your favorite pods. Join us, and perhaps you may be able to help
Solve a mystery.
Okay, so you're suggesting it was it to change his appearance, or was this like Life 2.0?
This was Life 2.0.
Yeah,
this is like the Lori
Barbie and
and Chad
Ken
show.
Yeah.
We're beautiful people who live on a beach in Hawaii, and we're going to get away with all of it. And, you know, it's really hard to parse the self-interest, the self-righteousness, because it all blends together. Right. And, you know, Nate Sunderland, who's been a really wonderful resource for us of East Idaho News, has sort of said that he thinks the working theory is that the religious justifications were purely justifications. It was what they were using as an excuse to get what they wanted, which was sex and money and a new life for themselves. And, you know, what better justification? You're not just telling yourself that you're taking it because you want it, but you're taking it because it's righteous. Yeah. This is what God wants from you. And so I think that, you know, you see that driving this sense of specialness and superiority in the two of them. And just, like I said, an enormous amount of hubris.
Talking about them being on the beach completely reminded me, and I forgot to ask you this. I love the way your podcast opens with Woman on Vacation. Is her name Ursula?
Ursula Berliner.
She's
Wonderful. All
of us. She is us. She is the, you know, woman who follows these stories. And I mean, that would be me. I would be the one my kids would be like, please don't do it. Please don't say anything. Yeah. But she spotted Lori Vallow and recognized her and has this moment of mouthing to her, like, where are your children? And I am just like, give this woman a trophy for doing that. Amazing that you found her and talked to her.
Yeah, I only have respect for a true busybody. And Ursula Berliner is like, she wasn't letting that moment pass. Yeah. And so one of my colleagues found Ursula and convinced her to talk to us. And she was amazing. We just sort of like put a microphone in front of her, and she is like a natural storyteller. And she was like, you know, like so many people, she had become completely captivated by this story. And she was also very angry. You know, I think a lot of people have taken this story very personally. I've spoken to a lot of people who have said to me, or have prefaced their comments by like, as a mother or as a Mormon or as X, you know, and I think a lot of people have seen an adulteration of their sort of fundamental principles of life disordered by this story. Yes. And they're pissed.
Yes, that's what I was trying to say earlier. You said that so well. Yeah. That personal, it's like an insult. It's so hard for us to stomach and wrap our heads around, but it is getting to something I'd like to explore with you, which is the gender factor of this story, which I don't think can be ignored. Okay, so imagine the story was actually Lori was missing and, you know, Jennifer Dulos. We love nothing more than like a missing mom story, especially if she's rich or middle class, because we don't imagine that can happen. It's an outlying situation.
For sure.
But then we also love when we hate to love, or we love to hate when like it's the mom that's the killer. And it feels like there's a special kind of animosity we reserve for mothers who kill. And on one hand, I can totally understand it as a woman and a mother. And on the other hand, I'm like, wait, why? Like, why are we more in tune with Lori's part of the story than Chad's? Well, they were Lori's kids, so I understand that. But Chad's wife died at his hands. He's the one on trial right now looking at a death penalty sentence. Lori will be, though she's pre-trial because of the mental health stuff. But why do you think it's been very pushed as the Lori Vallow narrative.
Yeah. Cult mom Lori Vallow.
Exactly.
Which is so catchy, as like Nancy Grace, I think, coined her. But
yeah, she loves a moniker.
I've thought about this a lot in terms of my own interest in this case. I think the gender thing I think it for sure is part of the picture. And I think, and it's possible that I am not immune from falling into that trap. I mean, I think when it comes to true crime stuff, we tend to like the two opposite poles of women. We like the virtuous victim and we like the truly sinister perpetrator, right? Those are people we're really interested in when it comes to women, like nothing in the middle, like no nuance, and I think one of the things that's so interesting about Lori Vallow is she kind of seems like a bit of both, because she is somebody who conformed to society's norms for a really long time. She was who we want women to be. She was married and she kept herself trim and she was like physically beautiful and she went to church and she was a mother. And, her Annie Cushing, her ex-sister-in-law, described her as someone with an effervescent personality. Mm-hmm. That to me is so like really meeting societal demands for what we expect of women. And so I think what captivates us with Lori is the transition. How has this woman who has on the surface what appears to be a really admirable life, who has met most of society's goals, living in as I sort of said in the podcast, a series of McMansions with her children. She had in Charles, from several accounts, an adoring husband. Mm-hmm. How does she go from that really socially sanctioned, ordained life to somebody whose kids are being dug up in her new husband's backyard? And I think that's the fascination. And that's the terror too, right? Because it doesn't make sense. Yeah. And it certainly doesn't make sense if you think of it in terms of day to night, because that's not what happened with Lori. It wasn't a switch was not flicked and she instantly became a different person. This was a slow decline that escaped a lot of people's attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And it speaks to where she sits now, which is under a really long, I learned on your podcast, 6-month potentially evaluation for her mental competency. So she's been deemed incompetent to stand trial right now, which is why her trial isn't moving forward the way Chad's is. What does that mean for the future of her trial? I spoke with Beth earlier this week. Idaho, and I learned on your podcast, Idaho there is no insanity defense. So we know her lawyers can't come with that, but obviously they want her to be coherent enough to participate in her own defense. But is this a strategy too, just her being silent and waiting this out? Or do we think she's under some serious trauma? What do you think and what do you know?
So there's no way to know what's going on in Lori's head. My understanding is that she has been declining to take medicine. And she has also, I've heard from her brother, Adam, that she has declined to speak with most people, I understand, other than her primary attorney, Mark Means. So, I mean, in terms of it being a strategy, I really have no idea. And I really have no idea how long this could possibly go on for. I mean, I guess it could possibly go on forever. I do think, like, Idaho being one of the states that doesn't allow for an insanity defense, it is still really important that Lori is able to defend herself against allegations in a court of law. Like, that's a pretty fundamental part of the justice system. And if she is genuinely not competent, and there's of course a lot of people who would like to see her punished, are skeptical about that diagnosis. But if she's genuinely not competent to engage with the proceedings, then it is not reasonable for her to address these charges or answer for these charges.
I would normally say, yeah, I agree. And I believe that to be true. I believe also in this case, what's the timeline from when she was arrested to now, and what happened in that time period? What was she doing, and what can we point to saying that she was, by all accounts, if not thriving mentally, making decisions that showed agency and awareness, to now?
So again, I don't have a complete set of information involving this, but my understanding is that she has been demonstrating signs of incompetence from the very moment she was arrested. And I have heard that she claims that her attorney, Mark Means, is her son that she had with an angel.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, what does Lori actually believe? What does Chad actually believe? These are really core questions that we can't answer. And really nobody can answer except for Lori and Chad. And so far, at least, they certainly don't appear to be willing to cooperate with that.
Right. And Chad's plea so far is not guilty.
Yes. And what will be interesting now, I think, so they were supposed to be tried together. So originally they were going to be charged separately or tried separately. Then their cases were joined for sort of expediency's sake. And now, in part because Lori has been declared not competent, John Pryor, Chad's attorney, has filed for severance, which means he would like Chad to be tried separately from Lori. So there have long been sort of working theories of this case. One that emerged very early was that Alex was heavily involved. Lori's brother was heavily involved, and that the two of them might try to pin it on him because he's dead. So it's convenient. Now the question is, with Lori declared incompetent, does Chad turn on her and sort of say, listen, you can see she's not well. She's, medically unwell. This was all her idea. I did these things to stop her. I should have done more, but, it's all crazy.
And wonder what his answer will be to why he buried the bodies. I mean, that is just next level.
Well, his kids say that he didn't bury the bodies because he's got a lot of, he worked as a grave digger. And if he buried the bodies, he would have done a better job.
What a cold comfort that is. I don't even, I know they say that. I've seen them speak out, but we know he did because of the text he sent his wife, who was alive at that time, about this whole raccoon story, which is in the podcast.
That's a wild story. Yeah.
Yeah. He claims, he goes out of his way to text his wife in the middle of the day that there was a raccoon on the property. He killed it. He dug up a grave and buried it. There's another one in the pet cemetery, just really out of his way to explain the, probably mounds of dirt on the property. And yet again, also demonstrating more sloppiness, right? They did not appear to think about their digital footprint at all. My understanding is that law enforcement has, Nate Sunderland said terabytes of evidence, implicating the two of them, that they were pretty freewheeling with their communications. And again, seem to have convinced themselves, either for pure secular arrogance or for religious reasons, that they were not going to be caught. Yeah. Yeah. And how much do you think it could be true that Alex was the big piece? What was the big piece of evidence with him and his cell phone?
That his cell phone pinged off the towers near Chad Daybell's house right around the time they believed the kids were being buried in the backyard.
Right.
And that is, I believe, what led law enforcement to search Chad's backyard for the bodies.
Pretty big. And so he's unfortunately passed, and that was ruled a heart problem. Doesn't seem suspicious as far as we know.
It's very convenient. So it does seem suspicious, but there was an autopsy and it was determined that he died of a pulmonary embolism. So blood clots in his lungs. He had extremely high blood pressure. It sounds like he was potentially at a stage in his life when he was under a lot of stress. We can only guess what that means. I do think Alex is actually a really fascinating character in all of this. And he and Lori, they seem different. I think a lot of people describe Alex as this lovable loser. He was in his early 50s. He was married once when he was really, really young. And then I believe it was annulled. But he never married. He didn't marry again until 2 weeks before his death, which is, again, speaking of rabbit holes, whole other rabbit hole. But he never had kids. He didn't really seem to make a home for himself anywhere. He had a series of sort of dead end jobs. Then he became a truck driver. A lot of people describe him as a very sweet guy, but kind of a loner who just never really seemed to grow up. And the parallel with Lori, to me, seems like they were both their whole lives chasing some sense of purpose, and they just never really found it. And then it does seem like when they crossed paths with Chad Daybell, he delivered those things at their feet. You know, what a missing piece, that you were this triumphant angel in a former life. You are one of the most important biblical figures. That's a pretty big missing piece.
Yeah, people like to feel they have a purpose in their life. And if you are missing that and someone is assigning you one and you're vulnerable to it, sure, that's compelling.
Totally.
And
totally intoxicating.
He followed Lori when she relocated, right? So that's why he was
did.
even like, you're right. He didn't have a home and a grounded foundation of his own. He really seemed to ride her coattails a bit. Yeah, it's unfortunate he's not present to help with the case. What do you expect for the two trials, your involvement? Do you get to zoom in? Do you get to attend? Will you be able to be witness to either?
So I would love to attend. I mean, who knows when Lori will come to trial?
Yeah.
Because she was assessed for an initial 90-day period. I believe she's now being assessed for an additional 180 days.
Yeah.
So a lot will depend on what happens after this additional assessment. It is still, of course, likely that Chad will come to trial first, given that things are still in motion for him. Like, his case has not been stayed, unlike hers. But I still think, you know, the death penalty is on the table. He's been accused of very serious crimes. I can't imagine this trial will take place before spring 2022. I'd be really shocked. It was initially supposed to start, I think, late November 2021.
Right.
It has been pushed back. So who knows? I will never stop following this case. And Beth Karras and I still talk all the time, and we still text and like call each other when there's new information, because, you know, I mean, I worked on this project for like a year, and it really consumed so much of my attention for a year. And it still consumes me because there's still so much that is unknown, some of which I think we will learn at trial. I think a lot of things we may have to live with never having answers to. I don't know that we'll ever get into Lori or Chad's heads. I don't know if I think we may be able to make educated guesses about their motivations. I don't know that we'll ever have a full picture of what happened. And not just with them, but, you know, you asked earlier if they were a cult. I'm not sure if you can have a cult of two people. I do think, though, that they had a community of enablers around them. And I will be very curious to know if we learn any more at trial about that. I suspect we probably won't learn a whole lot about that, but I think that's a really interesting piece of this that has been underexplored. There are a lot of people who have sort of slid under the radar, who know more than they have divulged, and who I think got caught up in this like kind of kooky thinking without ever thinking that it would escalate to this point.
Sure. I don't know why, and I'm sure I'm not coining this, but the word micro cult just came to me, and I'm thinking, ooh, what's that a thing? This was like a micro cult.
It was like a micro cult.
Are there any updates? And I'm hearing rumors of a bonus episode coming out that I think we can speak freely about, given when this comes out. So what will we learn in a bonus episode that we haven't so far?
So obviously, very early on in this process, I did my best to reach out to friends and family of Lori and Chad. Family has, of course, been the toughest to speak to, understandably. This is incredibly painful. I've been in touch with Adam Cox, Lori and Alex's brother, and his son, Zach Cox, for months and months. We've sort of stayed in touch. They talked to me about their experience, but it wasn't until a few weeks ago that they told me that they would sit down and talk to me in an interview.
Okay.
So that is our 6th episode. Our bonus episode is a discussion with Adam and Zach, where they tell us what they saw, who Lori was to them, and what they make of all of this. And crucially, what they want to see next, what they believe justice for Tylee and JJ looks like, and what they believe at this point Lori deserves. It's a really interesting discussion.
Oh my gosh, I cannot wait. Did it surprise you or confirm what you maybe imagined?
Yeah, some of it did surprise me. You know, I think some of it did surprise me, and they're very close. They have a really nice relationship, Adam and Zach. Zach is in his early 20s.
Okay.
They're not 100% on the same page about their interpretations of everything, which is also really interesting, you know, but they had a front row seat to so much as it unfolded. Zach lived with Lori and Charles as their relationship plunged into chaos. So he has a lot to say about what he saw. I think fundamentally, it's just a really human interview about what it means to be this close to a story that has been so wildly sensationalized and the impact that this has on a family. And it's awful. I mean, it's been a real struggle for their entire family, as you can only imagine.
We can only imagine. And I think it's a very sobering reality for true crime listeners, myself included, and an important one. I'm glad you're including it and publishing it so we can hear that and just remember the humanity of it all. I can't wait for that. I forgot to ask you this. One of my listeners wanted to know, because she's a teacher, but aside from family members, were there any reports in your coverage that you came across of concerns from school teachers, people who were just around the kids and saying something seems off? Did you come across that?
So we do now know, and this actually came out just recently after we made the podcast. In fact, we do now know that Charles and Lori were reported to, I don't know what the exact acronym is in the state, but essentially Child and Family Services at JJ's school had raised concerns, I think in particular about Lori's religious beliefs.
Wow.
And they were not fully investigated because, again, got a white family. JJ is clean. He appears, well cared for. Lori presents well. And it was just assumed that the kids were safe with these people.
Also, like, not a precedent you want to set of like going and interviewing, interrogating people about their religion and their beliefs. I'm sure there's like, that's delicate. And then
delicate.
Combined with what you just said, they were probably like, well, we'll let that one, we'll keep our eye open or something. And then.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting is up until near the very end, like a lot of the optics remained in place, right? Like, I mean, when things really start, I think the chaos part or the crisis part of the story really starts when Charles approaches the police in January 2019.
Yeah.
That is really when it's clearly become a family crisis. I mean, he at one point is talking about trying to get her excommunicated because he is so desperate. And it's also like kind of the start of several points at which, if there had been a greater intervention, if people had taken these concerns more seriously, this story might have taken a very different path.
Yeah. Oh, it's brutal. Brutal to think he saw the writing on the wall and then, he's gone. Another missing link to the story.
Yeah. I feel like Charles and Tammy get forgotten in this
because
of course, we're dealing with the murders of children, and it's just what happened to Tylee and JJ is so incredibly tragic. It's really hard to not focus your attention there.
Of course.
But, Charles and Tammy are tragic, and they're tragic for different reasons, I think. I mean, they're tragic for the same reason because of their untimely deaths. But, Charles is really the person who tried to stop all of this.
Yeah.
Charles sort of laid his body on the tracks and said, this is getting dangerous. This is going nowhere good. I don't know what she's going to do. She said she's going to murder me. I don't know what she's going to do to my children. He was really the one who was screaming for help.
Yeah.
And he didn't get that help. And then he was the first one to go.
Yeah.
And then, with Tammy, I think part of the reason that she gets lost is, I was speaking about cognitive dissonance earlier, victims often need advocates. And I don't want to judge the Daybell kids because I can't imagine what it's like to be in their position.
Sure.
But, and to have your mother dead and your father on, potentially facing the death penalty, to have them say, oh, no, like she was sick before she died. We heard her cough a few times, then she went to bed early one night. So when she, died in her sleep at 49, we weren't surprised. That requires a certain level of cognitive dissonance. And also, I think probably impedes the sense of justice we have surrounding that situation, because if her own children are not advocating on her behalf as a victim, then I think it just sort of tonally, her death it's a different experience for people as outside spectators. That's
a really good point. It reminds me of the Michael Peterson case and his children who stood by him until one, who was Kathleen's biological daughter.
Yeah.
She even stood by him until she kind of pivoted and then switched sides, which is really what it came down to. But that's a really good point. And it also makes me wonder what kind of, not grooming, but like conditioning is present for them. But again, to lose a parent in that way and to have one left, that's a terrible position to be put in. So who knows what your mind will allow you to believe or not believe. It's just really hard to get the head around, like most parts of this case. But also with Charles, I wonder if that's where gender played a role again. If it had been reversed and a wife was saying, I'm scared, I don't know what he's going to do, take my kids, hurt my kids. Like, I wonder if there would have been a stronger response if the other way around, just another way to think about it. But I really appreciate you coming on and giving us this window into making it and to the story itself. Before you go, and it's weird because the death penalty came up in this conversation, but I do ask all my guests before they go, last night on Earth, what would your meal be?
Okay, I did think about this.
Good.
So Mexico City, the tuna tostadas at Contramar, which is a wonderful seafood restaurant, or the pozole at Casa de Toña.
I really like and appreciate a specific answer, because the good news is we're not going anywhere, hopefully tonight or tomorrow. It's like, I can put that on a little list, like if I'm in Mexico City. So thank you.
Yeah,
and that
really
sounds
recommend.
Amazing. Very good. Thank you again, Sarah, for being here. And
thank you for having me.
We'll point everybody to the podcast. It's definitely one that I think just really successfully peels away these layers at what's at the heart of this story. And we'll keep listening and following it. Thank you so much for killing the small talk.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure, Rebecca. Take care.
Likewise. Dialogue is a Yellow Tape Media production, audio engineered by Jason Usry and produced, hosted, and edited by me, Rebecca Sebastian. If you love the podcast, please consider becoming a diehard by signing up at patreon.com/dialogue. Other ways to support the show? Follow along on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across platforms, and you can now watch most episodes on YouTube by subscribing to my channel, Rebecca Sebastian. For more information or to drop me a note, visit RebeccaSebastian.com. Until next time, thank you for listening and killing the small talk.